Hello everyone, my name is Bulko and welcome back to another class quick build guide. This time we're going to take a look at the fighter. Once again, this is by request from my Know Your Role video, so I am like always going to frame the discussion around roles. And because there wasn't any specifics about how to build out this character, I'll talk about a few different ways you can play a fighter. And arguably, fighters are relatively straightforward. They're going to be focused on being a frontline character, potentially a skirmisher or an archer, and they're really going to be either kind of filling that frontline tank role or being a striker and eliminating targets, and oftentimes doing both sort of at once, but really focusing on a single target. They have some minor ability to support and control with some of the martial archetypes you can select. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how you could build your fighter depending on what you want to focus on. But there is a little bit of flexibility for building out a fighter, and they might not be as straightforward as they seem depending on that martial archetype you pick. Also, it should be noted that fighters are the foundation to almost every incredibly powerful multi-class build, simply because of the level 2 ability you get, Action Surge, which is a free action that just lets you take an additional action, and this lets you do some really powerful combinations later on. And we're talking about Nova-ing, almost the highest damage per round builds, focus on taking 2 levels of fighter so that they can accomplish that particular combination specifically. All right, so to start off with this build, I'm going to talk about making a Eldritch Knight. So this is actually a very specific type of fighter build, and I'm going to go with a dex-based build. As a race, I started off as a gnome simply because it's going to give me a +1 in dex and +2 in intelligence. Not that I necessarily will care about this come launch, because we're going to be able to put our points anywhere, but just know that as a sort of basic array when it comes to building a character, 2 16s, a 14, 2 10s, and an 8 is a fairly good starting point with most characters, because pretty well most classes or most builds would care about 2 to 3 stats. So having 2 16s for sort of your main attributes or your main ability scores, and then 1 14 to throw into Constitution is almost always just going to be good. With that all said, this character is dexterity focused for now, and that means I'm going to be wearing sort of medium armor, and I'm going to use a sword and shield. And because I'm a fighter, I also get a fighting style, and I've chosen defense right now. So at level 1, as soon as I throw a shield on, I actually have an incredible 19 AC, which is making me incredibly tanky. And then once I hit level 3 with this character, we'll talk about this a little bit later, I have a few other tools I can do to augment this even further. And this is actually, the Eldritch Knight is actually one of the most survivable characters in the game. And while on paper and flavor-wise, it's sort of sold as a magical martial sort of spell wizard, at the end of the day, you're mostly a fighter that has a few spells that you're going to use to make yourself incredibly durable. So you are mostly a very tanky fighter, but you do have a cool couple of tricks you can pull out every once in a while. Just like I talked about in the Ranger build though, a fighter can go either strength focused or dexterity focused. And if you are going to go something like Battle Master, you won't need the intelligence, obviously. And there is an argument to be made for going into at least 16 strength and like 16 con, and then even putting some points into dex to have a little bit higher initiative, even though you're not getting the AC bonus. Getting that versatility of maybe even being able to have a better ranged weapon, and definitely the reflex saves and initiative bonuses are worth not dumping, because you're not going to get much out of intelligence, wisdom, or charisma as a fighter unless you're specifically looking to have a second, like your fighter be your party face, which you could do on a playthrough. You could, focus on strength, a little bit left in con, and then just put a bunch of points into charisma, because that's what you want to do for your role-playing purposes. And that would totally be a viable build, because fighters really only need the one stat they're attacking with, and then Constitution. There's also a build of Eldritch Knight where you don't take much intelligence at all, because this is really only going to affect your spell saves. And we'll talk about this a little bit later when we're hitting level 3 and we're looking over the spells that are available, because there are quite a few spells that you can take that are very powerful that actually don't require a high intelligence at all. And Eldritch Knights are only ever really going to get up to second level spell slots unless you're multi-classing in Baldur's Gate 3. So your limit on what you can take is you're fairly restricted, and you won't necessarily need a super high intelligence score to make advantage, especially if you're going to be spending all your spell slots on defensive buffs that aren't going to require any saving throws. So even having your intelligence as a high score is mostly optional. With that out of the way, in my terms of my origin, I selected Urchin, which is going to give me sleight of hand and stealth proficiency right out of the gate. I am a dex build, so this sort of lets this character be a bit of a scout, and potentially the character that's going to be opening locks and things for me. So I won't necessarily need to have a rogue. Obviously, a rogue or a bard with expertise and all their other bonuses are going to do it a little bit better, but this is going to be a character that could do those things, well enough in a pinch. In my actual skills, I have athletics, and I'm not going to take intimidation. I might take something like acrobatics. Athletics is only getting me a +2, but this is going to help me, shove a little bit more. And then acrobatics is going to help me reduce my damage if I'm falling or if I'm jumping down on things. And I have a high dex, so yeah, that's fine. Obviously, skills, they're kind of up to you what you're looking to do with the character, and you have a little bit of a flexibility, but fighters don't get a ton of proficiencies and they don't get a ton of options. Now, as a class, we do have the fighting styles. With an Eldritch Knight, you can make sort of an arcane archer sort of build where you're focusing on archery and then you have your spells to augment that and you're kind of sticking to the back line. It's totally fine. It's not necessarily what I'm going to do with this build though, and I want the option to use a bow sometimes or to go sword and board. Dueling is better if you're wanting to be that like dedicated frontline and most of the time you're doing your attacks. This is also great, but it does sort of restrict you. And it's going to limit your ability to equip other things. If you're taking defense, it means if you find a really powerful two-hander, you can just throw that on. If you find a good one-hander, you can throw that on. If you want a nice bow to use, you can throw that on. It just lets you use all the weapons you're going to find, and fighters can use them all. So this is going to give you the most flexibility and just always be viable. So I lean towards taking defense, and 19 AC at level 1 with a shield on is very good. So you're going to be incredibly tanky. And then if that wasn't enough, fighters also get second wind, which is a nice heal. It's 1d8 plus 1 for this character here. It scales with your level, so it's not going to go up a lot. So I'm level 1, so it's +1. Level 2 it goes to +2, so it scales a little bit, but it doesn't scale very fast. So it does start to fall off a little bit, but it's a bonus action. Pretty well you just use this whenever you're not full health in the first couple turns of combat when you have a spare bonus action, and it just keeps you in the fight that little bit longer, making you an even better frontline. You can almost think of this like a free healing potion, and when you press that short rest button, it's going to come back. So sometimes if you haven't used it yet and you forgot about it, you can still just use it outside of combat, hit the short rest, get even more heals back, and then it comes back again, and like you can almost get a full heal between 2-second wins and a short rest that way, and just keep going without having to use any supplies. So fighters, yeah, pretty good. And we'll go on and look at level 3, because level 2 you just get action surge. There's no decision points to make. You get action surge. So we're skipping level 2 with this particular build, and we're going to talk about level 3. Level 3 gets really interesting for your fighter, because this is where you get to take your martial archetype. In this build, we're going to take Eldritch Knight, but I do want to talk about the Battle Master as well. So Battle Master gives you these superiority dice, which are a resource that come back whenever you finish a short or long rest. And they give you some cool maneuvers, which are sort of like special attacks that you can use in combat. So Baldur's Gate has already added a few special abilities to the weapons, which gives you something else to do. And these kind of continue with that flavor, but they're even a little bit more powerful. So what they're going to do a lot of the times is they let you add your superiority dice to the damage of your attack, and then they'll have an additional effect. So this one will give your target frightened debuff. This one will knock them away. This one actually lets you like react when you become attacked. So it's really good for sneaking in extra damage as a frontline character. You can trip enemies, or you can even take the weapons out of their hands. There's also Rally, which lets you give temporary hit points to an ally as a little bit of a buffer, so that you can, another way of tanking essentially is just letting your allies survive an extra hit or so. So this is a really fun way to play fighter. These abilities can be used both melee and ranged. So whether you're an archer or a tank or a 2-weapon fighter, these are all going to be really viable. I'm not sure if any additional maneuvers get added on launch, but these are the ones that we have to play around with in early access, and they all have some fun uses. And really, it's just that superiority dice being added to your damage really helps you just be a bit more of a striker as well. And because they come back on that short rest, it really feels like you can use them almost every other turn pretty consistently, and you just get so many. But we are building an Eldritch Knight right now, so let's talk about that. First up, you do get a couple of cantrips. They have it defaulted to True Strike and Blade Ward, and I would say immediately get rid of True Strike and pick pretty much anything else. A couple of standout mentions in terms of an attack cantrip would be something like Chill Touch, Firebolt, or Ray of Frost. These all have situational uses. Firebolt, it's a 1d10 damage, so it is the most. It's sort of like the bog standard of the ranged attack cantrips. It notably does set things on fire, and Larian loves putting in little spire webs and grease traps and all sorts of fun things that you can light on fire. So Firebolt is always just going to be fun for that. Likewise, Ray of Frost is great because all those little blood pools you get accumulating in the battlefield can absolutely be turned into skating rinks, and hitting an enemy that has blood all around them will not only damage them, but actually potentially knock them prone. And having an attack cantrip is not a terrible idea on an Eldritch Knight, because you do get an ability later on that whenever you cast a cantrip, you can make a free attack. So that's worth noting as well. And Blade Ward, it is worth noting that this is actually good in Baldur's Gate 3. In the tabletop version of the game, this is also seen as a bit of a trap, because we have the ability called Dodge, which is just an action any character can take that gives disadvantage to all attackers. And in some cases, it's like, well, why would you ever cast Blade Ward and take it as a cantrip when you could just dodge and it's effectively doing something very similar? Well, in Baldur's Gate 3, this lasts 2 turns, not just 1 turn. And so that means you can use it before combat starts and still get some use out of it. And also, as an Eldritch Knight, as I mentioned, at level 7, whenever you cast a cantrip, you can still make a bonus attack. So that means you're giving up at level 7 1 in every 4 attacks to have permanent resistance to all damage. You already have obscenely high armor class, and then in addition to that, you now have damage resistance pretty well all the time for not quite free, but all the time. It definitely makes you one of the most ridiculously difficult to take down frontline characters in the game. Obviously, it doesn't help you against things that are doing a lot of elemental damage, and as you get into higher levels, basic weapon attacks are going to be less common, but it still is situationally very good. And in those situations where the resistance isn't going to do much for you, just don't cast it. Do other things with your action. You have lots to do. You're a fighter, and by level 11, you're just smacking things 3 times a turn anyways, because that's what you do. And yeah, that's the cantrips. Going on to the leveled spells, you'll notice there's a couple of pools here. So for this pool, it is all the abjuration and evocation spells. So all the blasty bits and all the defensive spells. I personally don't really care for either of the abjuration options. They aren't really going to do much. We are going to be already wearing armor, so we don't need mage armor. And protection from good and evil can come from another class. We have so few spell slots, we're going to really save them for really clutch moments. Magic Missile is one of my favorite first level spells because it does not have an attack roll and there's no saving throw, which means it doesn't even matter how good your intelligence is, which means we could actually drop it a little bit with this character. But this is just going to do, 2 to 5 damage per missile to up to 3 targets, or you can put them all on one if you want. It's perfect for hitting that one person who's at 6 HP and you're like, I just need you to be dead for sure. I'm going to throw you all these missiles at you and finish you off. Or if there's 2 or 3 targets, I've had that happen in situations in combat where you have multiple low health targets. You can just pick them off, 1 or 2 targets. And unlike the pen and paper version of the game, in Baldur's Gate 3, you always know the exact hit points of your enemy. So you're not guessing and like hoping it's going to take them out. You can really make that tactical, calculated decision to use the spell and finish off your target. And then next, something like Thunderwave, just having that point blank AoE that's going to deal with multiple enemies that has a little bit additional utility in the sense that it knocks things away. It's really a fun spell. It does okay damage, 2 to 16 damage. It doesn't scale necessarily super well because you don't really get the spell slots as an Eldritch Knight, but having that additional area of effect that can knock multiple creatures away is good and definitely something worth using. So I like that one as well. Now, in terms of all the other spells you can potentially unlock at level 1, you do have some options and things to consider. So you get 1 bonus spell as an Eldritch Knight at level 3 that does not have to be from the evocation or abjuration list, meaning you can take, an illusion spell or an enchantment spell, and this is going to give you a few options. So Fog Cloud is a conjuration spell. This also doesn't require high intelligence to be effective with, so you don't need good intelligence. You can just grab something like this. And Fog Cloud blinds creatures that are in it. So what you can do as an Eldritch Knight is, you've cast your Blade Ward on yourself at the start of combat, you've initiated the encounter, and then your first turn you run up and then you cast Fog Cloud on yourself and your whole party. And now everybody's going to have, if they had any sort of advantage or anything against you, they're not going to be able to see you. They're not going to be able to target you effectively with anything ranged. They are going to be kind of on equal ground in that melee combat. And it's just blind creatures, blind leading the blind kind of situation. And it's really good at just stabilizing. You can't make opportunity attacks if you're blind. So it lets you move in and out around the battlefield. It lets all your squishy party members, escape the melee if they need to. It's a really fun utility spell. Lots of cool options there. You also have things like Tasha's Hideous Laughter. You will need a high intelligence modifier to make this worth it. It is a wisdom saving throw, and it is sort of a take a creature out of the fight spell. So it might be worth having something like this as on your fighter, just to have an option to say, I'm going to do a hard crowd control spell on that big beefy ogre and take him out of the fight. There's more area of effect spells like Grease that are decent. And also even Sleep is worth mentioning. This is another one that you don't need a high intelligence score for, because it's just a flat check. It just looks at their HP, and if they're under 24 hit points, they fall asleep. This one is also spread out. So if there's 2 enemies with 12 hit points or less, it'll put both of them to sleep. Or you can have, 3 enemies with 8 hit points, etc. So you can put multiple enemies to sleep. And this is also, it works as they're injured. So sometimes you might have an enemy that's taken a little bit of damage and then they fall below that threshold. You can use this to crowd control them, and it's going to be totally fine. It doesn't obviously scale as well later on into the game, but you can switch it out. And for those first few levels, when you unlock it, it's going to be pretty useful. Just because it always works. Like, there is no saving throw or anything. It's going to waste their turn, which is useful. Find Familiar can be kind of fun to have those little pets running around the battlefield. It is very flavorful and fun, and they do often, at the very least, just take up an enemy's action to kill them. So worst case scenario, end game, you're going to distract something and it's going to walk up and slap your toad or whatever, and then you go about the rest of your combat as per normal. And then best case scenario, it's actually going to survive a couple turns and do a little bit of damage. There's also honorable mentions to things like Longstrider. So this increases your base movement speed by 3 meters, and it lasts until long rest, and there's no concentration. So you just turn this on, and all of a sudden your fighter just has that much more mobility. 3 meters is a decent amount, especially as someone like a gnome that doesn't have a lot of movement. It's great. Something like Jump, once again, no concentration. It lasts for 10 turns. It's pretty fun in terms of being able to jump, tripling your jump distance lets you jump very, very far. So especially in Baldur's Gate 3, when there's so many encounters that have a Z axis, that it lets you, jump onto the roof or jump over these huge gaps. It really lets you have an incredible amount of mobility. And jump is often the difference between getting to make a powerful melee attack on your turn or having to resort to throwing a javelin or shooting a bow or something. So jump should not be undersold. Expeditious Retreat is similar. It lets you double your movement essentially by turning your bonus action into a free dash, but it is concentration. So that is potentially a little bit of a detractor, where something like Longstrider gives you that extra 3 meters, not quite doubling, but it doesn't take a bonus action and it's just always on forever and all time. And then if you want to get really silly, technically, if you somehow could combine them with your spell slots, which you can't as an Eldritch Knight, but yes, you could combine these as well and just be flying all over. Something like False Life is also, you could just, I'm going Uber Tank and I just want to use my spell slots to have just more HP. Once again, this lasts forever, but you don't have a lot of spell slots as an Eldritch Knight, so I would rather have a high impact spell. Something like Sleep that's going to for sure take something out of the fight, or even something that's going to augment my ability to move around the battlefield. So it is up to you what you want to take. Lots of really viable options, but for me, this is something that I would take. The only spell that I have that cares about my intelligence is Thunderwave, which requires a saving throw. Otherwise, this build could absolutely work even if you don't have a super high intelligence. And then a lot of the level 2 spells you're going to take as an Eldritch Knight are things like Mirror Image, if you can eventually take it, or like those kind of defensive spells. And it's not in early access, but sort of the bread and butter spell of the Eldritch Knight is the Shield spell, which is a reaction that gives you +5 AC. I'm not sure if that's going to come in at launch, but if it does, you're obviously going to grab that one because it is so powerful. So that's sort of the first few levels, getting up to Eldritch Knight and talking about a lot of the first level spells. Lots of fun options there. We can talk a little bit about some multi-classing. So fighters are one of the foundational classes, as I mentioned, when it comes to building any powerful multi-class, and really everybody loves having at least 2 levels of fighter in their build. So I mean, we don't need to go through every single class and talk about why they want to have Action Surge, but just know that that's a thing to consider. If you are trying to be a base fighter, so you want to mostly be a fighter and that's kind of your core identity, and you want to augment what a fighter does, there are a couple things to keep in mind. So as with all martial classes, you really want to get to level 5 at the very least as a fighter, so that you get 2 attacks per action. And fighter can sometimes feel pretty bad if you're not just doing a dip for that action surge, because if you don't go all the way to level 11, you're not going to get that 3rd attack. You do get a bonus ability score increase at level 6 as a fighter. So going 6 levels of fighter will let you take an extra feat apparently, will let you take an extra feat rather. And then up to level 8, you would get your regular feat. So you could go 8 levels of fighter and then 4 levels of something else. And then that would give you, an extra feat overall compared to another class, which usually is the sacrifice when you're doing multi-class things. But then you'd really need to be picking a class that's going to be worthwhile. So if you're going for that Eldritch Knight build, there's obviously the combination of fighter or wizard. Now, in that particular build, it would potentially be worth it to go 5 levels of fighter and then go 7 levels of wizard, because that'll get you up to 4th level spells, which means you're still going to be a pretty respectable spellcaster. You won't get some of the nice Eldritch Knight features like being able to cast a cantrip and then attack as a bonus action, but you're still going to get 2 attacks per round if you're just doing attacks. And then when you're not doing attacks, your spells are way more devastating than a straight Eldritch Knight, because you're going to be throwing things like fireballs and haste, and you're going to be doing all sorts of powerful spell shenanigans, and you actually will have a spell book, which is going to give you a lot of that versatility. So I think a fighter wizard combo is totally viable. It's not the cheesiest of builds. It's not quite on the level of something like a paladin sorcerer or a paladin warlock or even a bard paladin in terms of really synergistic, but it still is quite synergistic to be an Eldritch Knight with Wizard, and it's going to let you be that, you know, plate wearing, ridiculously tanky wizard, and that's going to also help with your concentration spells. So your concentration spells are just going to go a little bit longer, and honestly, it's a build that I really find the flavor to be fun. I like being that spell caster in the front line, and sometimes you're just gonna have fun with that build. And if you're not going Eldritch Knight and you want to do fighter with something else, some of the other martials obviously are going to be a reasonable combination. So you could think about something like even a rogue if you're going to go for that dex-based fighter and using a rapier, give you some sneak attacks and some extra skill proficiencies. You can think about potentially even going something like cleric as a fighter, and that'll give you some potentially like buffs and support spells. Obviously, like you could do like a fighter paladin. There's so many different combinations, but at the end of the day, really a lot of classes are more than happy to take 2 levels of fighter and then go into the rest of their full class, and that's going to let them do some pretty wild combos. So really, I think one of the more straightforward fighter multi-classes is that level 5 Eldritch Knight and then 7 levels of Wizard, especially if you're going for like Abjuration Wizard or Divination Wizard. That really solidifies your character as really tanky frontline character that has a ton of utility. You would get a ton of battlefield control and make a really powerful, really fun, very flavorful character. Bonus points if you play a fighter wizard combination as a Gith. This would be building the traditional Gish fighter wizard multi-class, the origin of the term. So yeah, extra points for flavor. And yeah, that's my fighter overview. It actually went a little bit longer, I think mostly just because I got to talk a little bit about those wizard spells. But once again, thank you for your support. I actually can't believe how much support I've been getting in these videos, and it's been super fun for me. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one. I currently don't have any requests, so this means I will probably talk about my favorite class, the Bard. See you then.